Before we begin, if you enjoy deep historical documentaries that reveal how money, power, and war truly shape our world, subscribe to this channel. These stories explain not just the past, but the system you're living in today. World War II destroyed nations, economies, and entire civilizations. Cities turned to ash, currencies collapsed, empires disappeared. But when the war finally ended, a new global system quietly emerged. One that would make some countries unimaginably rich and trap others in permanent dependence. This is the story of how World War II didn't just change history. It created the modern global economy. Before World War II ever began, the global economy was already collapsing under its own weight. The conflict did not erupt in a vacuum. It was born from economic failure, inequality, and a broken international system that had never recovered from World War I. The First World War left Europe financially exhausted. Entire nations were buried under debt. Germany was forced to pay massive reparations, draining its economy and humiliating its population. Britain and France emerged victorious on paper, but economically weakened, struggling to maintain their empires while servicing enormous war loans, many of them owed to the United States. Meanwhile, the global financial system was tied to the gold standard. This system was meant to create stability by linking currencies to gold reserves. But in reality, it severely limited governments' ability to respond to economic crises. When economies slowed, governments could not inject money into the system without risking currency collapse. Deflation, unemployment, and poverty spread rapidly. Then came the Great Depression. In 1929, the global economy imploded. Banks failed, stock markets crashed. International trade collapsed by more than 60%. Factories shut down. Millions lost their jobs, almost overnight. Entire societies lost faith in capitalism and democracy. Countries turned inward. Tariffs rose. Borders closed. Cooperation disappeared. Each nation fought for survival alone. Economic desperation created political extremism. In Germany, hyperinflation wiped out savings and destroyed trust in democratic institutions. In Italy, economic stagnation fueled fascism. In Japan, a lack of resources pushed aggressive expansion into Asia. By the late 1930s, the global economy was no longer just fragile, it was hostile. Nations believed survival required control over resources, markets, and labor. War became an economic strategy. World War II did not simply begin with military ambition. It began because the global economic system had failed, and no one knew how to fix it peacefully. When World War II began, governments were forced to take actions that would have been politically impossible during peace. They did not merely fight battles, they completely transformed their economies. This was the largest economic mobilization humanity had ever seen. Factories stopped producing consumer goods and began manufacturing tanks, aircraft, ships, ammunition, and weapons at unprecedented speed. Governments controlled prices, fixed wages, rationed food, and directed labor. Entire populations were reorganized around war production. No country experienced this transformation more dramatically than the United States. Before entering the war, America was still suffering from the Great Depression. Unemployment was high. Factories sat idle. Economic recovery was slow and uncertain. War changed everything. The US government unleashed massive spending. Billions of dollars poured into industrial production. New factories were built in months, not years. Millions of jobs were created almost instantly. Women entered the workforce on an unprecedented scale, permanently reshaping society. Unlike Europe and Asia, the United States was never bombed. Its cities remained intact. Its infrastructure expanded rather than collapsed. While much of the world was being destroyed, American industry was growing stronger. War spending succeeded where economic policy had failed. It ended the Great Depression. Meanwhile, Europe and Asia were being devastated. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. Transportation networks collapsed. Industrial capacity was destroyed. By 1945, much of the world was economically shattered. This created a massive imbalance. One nation emerged from the war, richer, stronger, and more industrially powerful than ever before. Most of the world emerged desperate, indebted, and dependent. That imbalance would shape the future global economy and determine who would write the rules. When World War II finally ended in 1945, the world faced an economic reality unlike anything in human history. Entire continents lay in ruins. Europe's factories were destroyed. Asia's cities were burned. Transportation networks were shattered. Food shortages were widespread. Currencies were weak, unstable, or worthless. But in the middle of this devastation, one country stood almost untouched: the United States. While much of the world had been bombed into collapse, American cities remained intact. Its factories were not destroyed, they had expanded. Its workforce was fully mobilized. Its financial system had grown stronger, not weaker. By 1945, the United States produced nearly half of the world's industrial output. It held more than 50% of the world's gold reserves. Its currency was stable. Its economy was booming. For the first time in modern history, global power was no longer centered in Europe. It had crossed the Atlantic. Europe needed food, machinery, fuel, and capital just to survive. Asia needed reconstruction from total devastation. And there was only one country capable of supplying all of it. America, this moment, marked a fundamental shift in global economics. Power was no longer defined solely by land or military strength. It was defined by production, finance, and currency. The United States did not conquer the world with armies after World War. It dominated through economics. And this dominance gave American leaders a unique opportunity, one they fully understood. They could allow the world to rebuild chaotically, risking another depression and future wars. Or they could design a new global system, one centered around American financial leadership. The choice was clear, but there was a problem. The world no longer trusted old systems. The gold standard had failed. Uncontrolled markets had collapsed. Isolationism had fueled extremism. If global stability was going to exist, it required something entirely new. Something structured, something centralized, something controlled. The question was no longer whether the United States would lead the global economy. The question was how. The answer would come not from a battlefield, but from a quiet mountain resort in New Hampshire. In July 1944, while World War II was still raging, representatives from 44 nations gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The war was not yet over, but its outcome was already clear. And the future was being negotiated in advance. This meeting would quietly become one of the most important economic events in history. The goal was ambitious: to prevent another Great Depression, to avoid economic chaos, and to stop financial collapse from ever again pushing the world into war. The solution they designed reshaped the global economy permanently. At the center of this new system stood the United States. The Bretton Woods Agreement created a new global financial architecture built on three pillars. The first was fixed exchange rates. Currencies would no longer fluctuate wildly. Instead, they would be pegged to the US dollar, which itself was backed by gold. This gave the world stability, but it also placed the dollar at the center of global finance. The second pillar was the creation of powerful institutions. The International Monetary Fund, or IMF, was designed to stabilize currencies and provide emergency loans to countries in financial trouble. In theory, it would prevent economic collapse. The World Bank was created to finance reconstruction and development. Its original mission was to rebuild war-torn Europe, but its influence would soon expand across the world. The third pillar, and the most important, was the elevation of the US dollar. Under Bretton Woods, the dollar became the world's primary reserve currency. Nations held dollars instead of gold. International trade was settled in dollars. Global finance revolved around American money. This was not accidental. Because the United States held most of the world's gold, only it could credibly back its currency. Other nations had no choice but to accept the system. In one agreement, the dollar became global power. This gave the United States an extraordinary advantage. It could run trade deficits without immediate collapse. It could print money to finance growth. And as long as the world needed dollars, demand for American currency remained constant. No empire in history had ever controlled global economics so subtly or so effectively. Bretton Woods did not create equality. It created stability under American leadership. And while the world welcomed recovery, few fully understood what they had agreed to. The modern global economy had been born, and it would soon reshape wealth, power, and inequality for generations. By 1947, Europe was on the edge of collapse. The war had ended, but peace did not bring relief. Cities were destroyed. Farms lay abandoned. Factories had no machines, no fuel, no capital. Food shortages were severe. Inflation spiraled out of control. In some regions, starvation was a real threat. Political instability followed economic despair. Communist movements gained strength across Europe, especially in France, Italy, and Greece. For the United States, this was alarming. Economic collapse did not just mean suffering, it meant the possible spread of Soviet influence. America understood a crucial lesson from the interwar years. Economic chaos leads to political extremism. So in 1947, the United States announced an unprecedented program, the Marshall Plan. Officially, it was a humanitarian effort. Unofficially, it was a strategic masterpiece. Over $13 billion, an enormous sum at the time, was sent to Western Europe. The money funded food supplies, rebuilt factories, repaired infrastructure, and stabilized currencies. European economies began to recover at remarkable speed. But the Marshall Plan was not free money. Aid came with conditions. European countries were required to cooperate economically, open their markets, and align with the US-led financial system created at Bretton Woods. Trade barriers were lowered. The dollar became central to transactions. American goods, technology, and influence flowed freely. The result was extraordinary. Western Europe recovered faster than anyone expected. Germany and France rebuilt their industries. Britain stabilized its economy. Productivity surged. Living standards improved. At the same time, Europe became economically integrated with the United States. This was not colonialism in the old sense. There were no flags planted, no governors sent. Instead, power flowed through loans, trade rules, and financial dependency. The Marshall Plan did something no empire had ever achieved so efficiently. It rebuilt rivals while ensuring long-term influence. Eastern Europe, under Soviet control, rejected the plan. This decision locked the continent into two economic worlds: a US-led capitalist system in the West, and a centrally planned socialist system in the East. The Cold War had begun economically. By rebuilding Europe, the United States did not just save allies. It cemented itself as the architect of the post-war world. And at the heart of that world was one thing, above all else: the American dollar. After World War II, money itself was transformed into a tool of power. Under the Bretton Woods system, the US dollar was no longer just America's currency. It became the foundation of global trade, finance, and reserves. Nations across the world held dollars to stabilize their economies. Oil, commodities, and international contracts were priced in dollars. This gave the United States an advantage unlike anything seen before. Because global demand for dollars was constant, the US could do something no other country could safely do: run deficits. America could import more than it exported. It could spend more than it earned. It could print money, and the world absorbed it. This phenomenon became known as dollar hegemony. While other nations needed to earn foreign currency to survive, the United States issued the currency everyone needed. Its debt became the world's savings. Its financial markets became global safe havens. Over time, this power deepened. American banks expanded internationally. US financial regulations influenced global standards. Wall Street became the center of global finance. And then, the dollar became something even more powerful: a weapon. Countries that aligned with the US gained access to trade, loans, and financial stability. Those that opposed it faced sanctions, frozen assets, and isolation from the global financial system. No bombs were required. Entire economies could be crippled by cutting off access to dollars. This was a new form of power, quieter than war, but often just as devastating. The United States did not need to conquer territory to dominate the global economy. It controlled the system itself. By the 1950s, the rules were clear. If a nation wanted to trade, grow, and borrow, it had to play by the rules of the dollar-based system. World War II had created an empire without borders, an empire of finance, and its influence would only expand as the Cold War intensified. As the post-war global economic system solidified, its effects became impossible to ignore. While the world officially celebrated recovery and cooperation, the reality beneath the surface was far more uneven. The new system created clear winners and permanent losers. Among the greatest winners were West Germany and Japan. Just a decade earlier, both nations had been enemies of the United States. Their cities had been destroyed, their economies were shattered. Yet, under the new US-led system, they experienced astonishing recoveries. West Germany benefited from Marshall Plan aid, access to American markets, and protection under US military power. Free from heavy military spending, it focused entirely on industrial growth. Within a generation, it became Europe's economic engine. Japan followed a similar path. Under American supervision, its economy was restructured. Land reforms, industrial policy, and access to global trade allowed Japan to rebuild rapidly. By the 1960s and 1970s, it had become one of the world's largest economies. These successes were not accidents, they were strategic. Strong allies meant stable markets, reliable trading partners, and ideological victories against communism. Prosperity became a political weapon. But while some nations rose, many others were quietly locked into disadvantage. Former colonies across Africa, Asia, and Latin America entered independence with weak institutions, limited industry, and heavy dependence on exporting raw materials. They needed capital to develop, and the only available sources were international lenders operating within the Bretton Woods system. Loans came with conditions. To receive IMF or World Bank assistance, countries were often required to cut public spending, reduce subsidies, open markets, and prioritize debt repayment. These policies stabilized currencies, but frequently slowed development and deepened inequality. Economic growth became uneven and fragile. While industrialized nations accumulated capital and technology, developing nations remained dependent on exporting low-value goods. The wealth gap between nations widened, not temporarily, but structurally. This was not the result of conspiracy. It was the result of rules. Rules written in the aftermath of war. Rules designed for stability, not equality. By the late 20th century, the global economy appeared interconnected, but power remained concentrated. The system rewarded nations already positioned to succeed and constrained those starting from behind. World War II had ended militarily in 1945. But economically, its outcomes were still unfolding and determining who prospered and who struggled for generations. As the Cold War intensified, the global economy became a battlefield. The United States and the Soviet Union did not only compete with weapons and ideology, they competed through aid, trade, loans, and economic influence. Money became a strategic tool as powerful as tanks and missiles. For the United States, the strategy was clear. Economic prosperity would prove the superiority of capitalism. Allies were rewarded with access to markets, investment, and financial support. Nations that aligned with American interests received development aid and military protection. Those that did not were isolated. The Soviet Union pursued a different path. It offered centralized planning, state control, and economic assistance to its allies. But without access to global trade and capital, its system struggled to match the productivity of the West. Across the developing world, newly independent nations were forced to choose sides. This choice was rarely ideological alone. It was economic. Align with the US-led system and gain access to loans and markets, but accept its rules. Align with the Soviet bloc and gain political support, but remain economically isolated. Many countries attempted neutrality. Most failed. Economic pressure was relentless. Sanctions became common. Trade embargoes were imposed. Financial access was restricted. Governments discovered that losing access to the global financial system could collapse an economy faster than war. This was a new reality. Conflict no longer required invasion. It required isolation. The Cold War also expanded military spending to unprecedented levels. Trillions were spent on weapons, research, and defense industries. Entire sectors of the global economy became dependent on perpetual tension. Fear fueled innovation. Innovation fueled profit. By the time the Cold War ended, the global economy had been reshaped once again. Capitalism had triumphed, but at a cost. Inequality deepened. Financial power became concentrated. Economic tools replaced armies as the primary instruments of control. The world appeared peaceful. But beneath the surface, the struggle for economic dominance never ended. By the late 20th century, the global economic system born out of World War II had done something extraordinary and deeply unequal. It created unprecedented wealth, but only for some. For the United States and its closest allies, the Bretton Woods system was a map. The dollar remained the world's primary reserve currency. American companies dominated global trade. Wall Street became the heart of international finance. And US military power quietly ensured that the rules of the system were rarely challenged. But for much of the world, especially in Latin America, Africa, and parts of Asia, the system felt less like cooperation and more like control. Many developing nations found themselves trapped in cycles of debt. They borrowed dollars to fund infrastructure, stabilize currencies, or recover from political crises. But when global interest rates rose, especially during the 1970s and 1980s, those debts exploded. This was the era of structural adjustment. The IMF and World Bank offered rescue loans, but with conditions. Governments were told to cut public spending, privatize state industries, reduce subsidies for food and fuel, open their markets to foreign competition. On paper, these policies were meant to stabilize economies. In reality, they often devastated ordinary people. Healthcare systems collapsed. Education budgets shrank. Local industries were crushed by foreign corporations with far greater resources. Entire generations were lost to poverty, not because their countries lacked resources, but because they lacked power within the global system. And the irony was brutal. The very institutions created to prevent another global catastrophe were now accused of deepening inequality. Meanwhile, the winners kept winning. Multinational corporations expanded across borders, protected by trade agreements and dollar-based contracts. Financial markets grew more complex, more profitable, and more disconnected from real production. Wealth concentrated at the top, both within nations and between them. Yet, despite repeated crises, oil shocks, debt crises, currency collapses, and financial crashes, the system never truly reset. Not in 1971, when the gold standard ended. Not in 1997, during the Asian financial crisis. Not even in 2008, when the global banking system nearly collapsed. Each time, governments intervened. Central banks printed money. Bailouts were issued, the rules bent, but they never broke. Because breaking them would mean questioning the foundation of post-war economic power, and that foundation still rested on a single truth. The global economy created after World War II was designed not to be fair, but to be stable under American leadership. A system that rewarded those who wrote the rules, and disciplined those who challenged them. But history was far from finished. As new powers rose, China, India, and others, cracks began to appear. The question was no longer whether the system was unequal. The question was whether it could survive a world where power was no longer concentrated in one place. World War II officially ended in 1945, but economically, it never did. Every time you swipe a credit card, trade cryptocurrency, invest in stocks, or watch currencies rise and fall, you are interacting with a system built from the ashes of that war. The US dollar still dominates global trade. The IMF and World Bank still shape national policies. Global supply chains still reflect post-war alliances and power structures. Even today, when countries are sanctioned, isolated, or cut off from the global economy, the weapon being used is not tanks or missiles. It is access to the financial system created after World War II. This is the quiet legacy of the conflict. A world where economic power became more decisive than military power, where control over money replaced control over territory, where wars could be fought without bombs, through interest rates, trade restrictions, and currency manipulation. And perhaps the most unsettling truth of all, the system was never meant to evolve naturally. It was designed in a moment of chaos, fear, and opportunity by nations that had survived total war and wanted to ensure they would never lose control again. That design still shapes who gets rich, who stays poor, and who decides the future. Today, we stand at another turning point. Rising geopolitical tensions, top challenges to dollar dominance. New financial technologies, new economic alliances forming outside the old system. Some call it a transition. Others call it the beginning of the end. But one thing is certain. To understand the modern global economy, you don't start with Wall Street, Silicon Valley, or cryptocurrencies. You start with World War II. A war that destroyed the old world and quietly built the one we live in now. If this video changed the way you see money, power, and history, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because in the next episode, we'll uncover another hidden chapter of history, one that still controls your future, even if you've never heard its name. This is not just history. This is the system you live inside.